shall we take a look inside? I think you're going to love this. The history of Walpole Old Chapel really starts in the year 1689 when 6 trustees were given permission by the Corporation of Southwold to take over this particular farmhouse, which was built earlier in the 17th century, plus an acre of land for the princely sum of 10 shillings a year rent. And the purpose of which, of course, was to convert this farmhouse into the chapel that we see today. But here is the problem. Obviously, to incorporate a congregation, it was necessary to rip out the floorboards in order to create a first floor gallery and to use the floorboards to create benches for the congregation to sit on. And there is certainly evidence of that here today just by wandering around inside the building. As you walk across the gallery floors, you can actually see and appreciate the craftsmanship of the local country folk who moulded this building. But there was a problem, of course. In order to create the gallery on the first floor and to widen the interior of the church, it was necessary to find an independent form to stabilise the structure of the building, because it would have been weakened once the floors had been taken out. And so what they did, they used, allegedly, the mast from a Dutch ship to support the roof and to create extra joints and joists to stabilise the structure of the building. Now on earth, where would a mast have come from originally? Well, 17 years prior to their acquisition of this building was a famous sea battle called the Battle of Sole Bay, which was performed off the coast of Southwold and involved an alliance between the English and French against the Dutch Navy. Apparently, a French frigate had spotted the Dutch warships approaching the coast, obviously prepared to take out the Alliance warships at port, but was able to get back in time to alert the others to the impending threat coming across the horizon. And so the battle commenced and ships from either side were lost in battle. One can imagine the consequences of that afterwards. There must have been many bodies being washed up on the beach at Southwold, and particularly so parts of damaged ships and ships that had sunk and broken away and floated to the surface. And perhaps this mast was one of those items that was washed up on the beach at Southwold. Well, they certainly took advantage of it, and you can see it here today. And without it, this glorious building would never have been able to be brought into being. By the 18th century, they were able to incorporate, again, handcrafted box pews, because they were the fashion of the day. And I should imagine to attract worshippers to this particular congregation, they had to keep up with the times. So the independents, as they were known, or Puritans as they're more commonly known, had to move with the times. They didn't exactly remain in stasis during that period of history, unlike the Amish, for example, in America. By the year 1958, the congregation here had sadly dwindled away. Part of the reason was a chapel which had been built much nearer to the town of Halsworth in Suffolk, where the majority of the congregation originated, and of course people having a preference for a safer journey and obviously a much more comfortable journey opted for the local new church, which would have had heating and would have been more accessible than travelling some distance from Halsworth to get to this particular chapel. And so gradually the congregation dwindled away, and sadly by 1958 it had served its purpose. It was passed over to another congregational church group, and they held on to it till the year 1970, when it was no longer required for Christian worship. And of course, over the years that followed, huge question mark was raised as to what to do with the building, whether to convert it into a luxury house, obviously set in a splendid part of the Suffolk countryside with the River Blythe a short distance behind the actual building and the rolling countryside in front of the building. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the building was saved for the nation by the Historic Chapels Trust, who took over the trusteeship of the building, and today it is open at weekends and run by volunteers for people to come here and enjoy the same ambience and beauty that I have on this particular visit. And it is a very interesting building. But before I go on further to talk about the history of the Puritans and also a discourse on religion and politics of that era, I want to take you on a very short journey around the building to give you some feel and some idea of the beauty of this amazing building. I love these box pews. I mean, again, that they're rather crudely constructed. I get the impression with some of these, they may have actually been removed from other churches. And particularly the numbering system. We've got number 11 here, number 17 and number 16. So they're all irregularly numbered. So were they actually taken from another place of worship and brought here? A question I can't answer. But I can imagine with the numbering, people must have reserved their own spaces when they came here to worship. Now, of course, the box pew was a fashion statement of the 18th century, and it allowed privacy, particularly for the wealthier members of the congregation, to segregate themselves from the rest. I suppose today we would look at that as being elitist, but of course in those days there were practical reasons I can imagine as to why they would have separated themselves from the rest of the congregation. Personal hygiene in that period wasn't particularly good, and only the very wealthy or the affluent could afford the luxuries of washing in warm water. So I can imagine on a hot summer's day like today, being sat in here, it must have had quite a heady aroma. And of course, nobody would like other people to look in on their conversations, which they might be having as the minister stands up in his pulpit, lecturing the congregation on the sins of the flesh, and so on and so forth. By modern standards, it's kind of eccentric and strange. But for me, from a historical perspective, it adds a certain quaintness, don't you feel? And if we look inside, you can see the doors are very crudely constructed, and of course some of them have actually got graffiti on them. And I found graffiti when I was wandering around upstairs on the actual rails of the gallery, as you can see here. I'm actually standing on the upper floor gallery, and I can imagine, going back to the 17th century, all of those people sat here praying, worshipping, listening to intently the hellfire and brimstone preachings of the minister from the pulpit. I can also imagine what it must have been like in the winter. It must have been very, very cold here. But the faithful gathered and the church prospered. There's a lot of history attached to this building, and I can imagine a lot of love to it as well. But the interesting notion here is that wandering around outside, looking at the graves that exist today, I can find no record of these early worshippers. Certainly there are no headstones attributed to anybody attached to this church at that period of history. Could it have been simply they did not subscribe to headstones? Or have they simply been replaced in the course of history? I'm so glad this building was preserved, because this is in itself a unique gem. It is something that cannot easily be replicated, and it is extremely rare, to say the very least. And I am so honoured to actually be here and to experience the ambience of this wonderful building. Following the reformation of the Christian Church by Henry VIII in the 16th century and the adoption of Protestant faith, many believers felt that the Church of England had not gone far enough in its reforms to separate itself from the old ways of the Catholics. In fact, many within the newly established Church felt that these reforms were too slow in their enactment, and that the Church needed to become more Protestant by purifying itself in worship and doctrine. The term Puritan, therefore, was a term of contempt assigned to the movement by its enemies. These reformers were very much aligned within the politics of the Church and those ideas of the French Protestant reformer John Calvin. Calvin believed in the doctrines of predestination and the absolute sovereignty of God in the salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. This, of course, placed the movement at odds with the monarchy, as they couldn't accept a mere king or queen to be their ruler over God. This, of course, placed them at odds with the ruling monarchy of the day, and as a consequence, sadly, many of these free thinkers were taken into custody by the king's men, and many were forced to flee the country to Holland or to worship in secret. This was very much the order of the day under Charles I and II, who were, after all, Catholics ruling over a Protestant state. And so the seed of dissent quietly simmered, not just under the Puritans, but also under other Protestant groups not aligned to the Church of the state or the king. From a political aspect, the Puritans were to the right wing of the Church, as opposed to the theoretical left of Quakerism, which evolved around the same time. Touching briefly on Quakers, they believed that everyone is equal and every person is good. They did not encourage any form of violence and believed that every problem can and should be solved peacefully. They were known as the Friends due to their love for peace. They did not have ministers and believed in equality for everyone, whether male or female, and were abolitionists for slavery. The Puritans, however, believed that everyone was born sinful and that most were destined for eternal damnation, and that only a select few were redeemable for salvation. They had their own elected ministers and did not suffer the rules of equality shared by the Quakers. Unlike the Quakers, the Puritans remained attached to the Church of England, with some remaining as worshippers, whilst others preferred their own worship in their own chapels as independents. The Quakers, as friends to all, met at their own form of chapel, being the Friends' Meeting House. Their only shared commonality was that both groups faced persecution in England and sought religious freedom in the American colonies. They disliked the rituals and hierarchical practices of the English Church, and they emphasized on simplicity in lifestyle as well as worship. It was, however, in the mid-17th century in the early American colonies established by the English Puritans that their differences resulted in punishment and death for Quaker colonists. In this regard, should a Quaker be apprehended the first time on arrival, they were politely refused entry and sent back at the captain's own expense to England on the ship they arrived in. A second return would result in a public whipping and a return. On the third violation, they were publicly executed by hanging, and a few were executed in this manner. Of course, not all Quakers were caught, and in effect they were able to establish a religious foothold, although in the early days their friends' meetings would have been held in secret. To many Americans, the Puritans are strongly associated with the early colonization of the New World, and it is here that I wish to expand further. These settlers, who first arrived in 1620 on board the Mayflower, believed that England, with its monarchy and a church filled with bishops, were seemingly unwilling to mend their ways, and saw the New World as an opportunity to create a new society. In fact, they named the area they settled in as New England to emphasize these hopes. The largest numbers arrived in the period 1630 to 1640, and apart from their initial colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts, they spread further to establish more colonies throughout New England. Of course, despite their wishes to be independent, they still relied on the old country for much-needed supplies and skilled craftsmen to build and expand. By 1630 came the largest migration, with a new governor in the form of a Puritan leader named John Winthrop. Also in the 1630s, there was a renewed effort by bishops of the Church of England to enforce uniformity in the Church by ensuring strict compliance with the style of worship set out in the Book of Common Prayer. The Court of High Commission came to be the primary means of disciplining Puritan clergy who refused to conform. This led to the ejection of many non-conformist Puritans and created a schism of sorts between the Puritans and the Church. It was only after the English Civil War during the short-lived Republic from 1649 to 1660 and following the execution of Charles I that they as a movement were able to worship without fear or malice from the now proscribed monarchy and Church of England. But having so much power and influence created its own problems. During the English Civil War, Puritan iconoclasts were very much active across much of Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, in the form of a Puritan soldier, Captain William Dowsing and his men. In December 1643, he was appointed by their Captain General, the Earl of Manchester, as Commissioner for the destruction of monuments of idolatry and superstition. In all, he visited over 250 churches, removing or defacing items that he thought fitted the requirements outlined in the remit of his employment. For example, at Badley Church in Suffolk, they actually shot up the church, and if you go to the church today, there are still traces of bullet holes in the door. And it's very difficult to see on that camera lens the extent of the actual damage. There is just here, there is a bullet obviously went into the door, but it didn't penetrate through to the other side. And just up here, the bullet went cleanly through the door. And during excavations they carried out some years ago, they actually found some of these bullets buried deep underground. And I dare say they probably shot the rest of the church up, but the plaster has since been repaired. Such was the act of vandalism and ignorance of these people. And as a result of which, many fine works of art were either looted from churches or they were destroyed. Priests were assaulted, and the weirdest aspect of all was that the altar floor was lowered to the ground, because no priest could be higher than any member of a congregation. Because when we think about it, of course, all men were equal. The problem is, of course, that some people were more equal than others, and particularly the Puritan hotheads like Captain William Dowsing. In fact, today we know that he performed these acts because he kept meticulous records of his dark deeds. Dowsing was born and raised at nearby Laxfield, and here are two entries of visits to his village church and also the nearby town of Halesworth.
Halesworth, April 5, 1643. 2 crucifixes, 3 of the Holy Ghost and 3 of the Trinity altogether, and 2 other superstitious pictures and more, 5 popish inscriptions of brass, Orate pro animibus, and Cuius animae propitiator Deus, and the steps to be levelled by the parson of the town and to take off a cross on the chancel, and then the churchwardens had order to take down 2 crosses off the steeple. Laxfield, July 17, 1644. 2 angels in stone at the steeple's end, a cross in the church and another on the porch in stone, and 2 superstitious pictures on stone there. Many superstitious inscriptions in brass, Orate pro animibus, and Cuius animae propitiator Deus. A picture of Christ in glass, an eagle and a lion with wings, for 2 of the evangelists, and the steps in the chancel, all to be done within 20 days. The steps by William Dowsing of the same town.
It should be stressed, however, that the practitioners of iconoclasm weren't all Puritans, as these acts of religious vandalism were performed by Christians of all persuasions since the Reformation. But like any ideology, they are always those who took things too far. In fact, many Puritans were appalled by Dowsing's actions, although others believed, like Dowsing, that in order to remain in God's will, religious intolerance was required. After all, tolerance was a form of weakness that insulted God, risked people's souls, endangered the government, and broke down the community. But despite the actions of the iconoclast Puritans, they had no real political power, since the ruler, Oliver Cromwell, who served as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, had sympathies with all the independents, such as here in Suffolk, which remained until his death in 1658. In 1662, following the restoration of the monarchy in the form of Charles II, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity, restoring the Book of Common Prayer as the official liturgy. The Act of Uniformity prescribed that any minister who refused to conform to the Book of Common Prayer by St. Bartholomew's Day would be ejected from the church and refuse a license to practice their beliefs. The majority of ministers who had served in Cromwell's state church conformed to the Book of Common Prayer. However, around 2,000 Puritan ministers resigned from their positions as Church of England clergy as a consequence. After 1662, the term Puritan was generally supplanted by nonconformist or dissenter to describe those Puritans who had refused to conform in 1662. And this was the case here in Suffolk. As a result, they suffered under one of the most severe campaigns of religious repression in English history. Surprise raids on dissenting meetings ended with imprisonment and heavy fines. In 1664, Parliament passed the Conventicle Act banning religious assemblies of more than 5 people outside of the Church of England. In 1665, it passed the 5 Mile Act, forbidding ejected ministers from living within 5 miles of a parish from which they had been banned, unless they swore an oath never to resist the king or attempt to alter the government of church or state. Under the penal laws forbidding religious dissent, many ministers were imprisoned in the latter half of the 1660s. One of the most notable victims of the penal laws during this period, though he was not himself an ejected minister, was John Bunyan, a Baptist, who was imprisoned from 1660 to 1672. These hardships would have been even greater here in Suffolk if sympathetic gentry had not given them shelter and support. In these parts, the Brewster family, 10 miles north of Wrentham, one of whom was an MP in the Long Parliament, had commanded a troop of horse in Cromwell's army, was a particularly noted example of this. Another was the remarkable Lady Brooke, 4 miles south of Yoxford. She was a theologian who gave Samuel Manning, their leader, much succour in hard times. In 1676, he published a sermon in gratitude to her. During the height of Puritan popularity, and during the reign of Cromwell and the new Commonwealth, there appeared another dissenting group of independents under the Puritan umbrella called the Ranters. Their ideas seem more pantheistic in the senses that they believe that God is essentially in every creature, and many seem to have rejected a belief in individual immortality and in a personal God. They believe that Christians are freed by grace from the necessity of obeying Mosaic law, rejecting the very notion of obedience, thus making any government's view of them as a potential threat. The Ranters stressed the desire to surpass human condition and become godlike. They held that a believer is free from all traditional restraints, that sin is a product only of the imagination, and that private ownership of property is wrong. Unlike mainstream Puritans, they enjoyed music, drinking, and dancing naked, and as such were described as having a general lack of moral values or restraint in worldly pleasures. In the early days, they were often confused as being Quakers, as their beliefs seemed too far to the left of the religious spectrum. In fact, like other Puritans, they even devised their own names for their offspring. Whereas we have been passed down prudence, charity, and hope, to name but a few, they had more radical alternatives such as humiliation, no merit, reformation forsaken, and for sorry for sin. For many years, scholars rejected the notion that they ever existed, yet records of births, marriages, and deaths confirmed them to be true. Like many dissenters, they eventually faded away into history, or were absorbed into other groups. Throughout the centuries and across all of Europe, many innocent women and some men were accused and executed for the alleged crime of witchcraft. Often the punishment meted out was death by hanging or fire. and even the proving or the admonishment of suspected witches through trial by water sometimes led to further deaths. Medieval Europe was a land still bound by the beliefs of the earlier pagans, and witches were, according to this tradition, servants of Satan himself, and the only prescription to end this evil was by death. The pinnacle of its popularity was during the 17th century, and mostly as a result of the work of one Matthew Hopkins and his gang of acolytes, the son of a Puritan priest who was born in Great Wenham in Suffolk in the year 1620, and following the death of his father, who was quite a wealthy man, owning tenements at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, he came to this area with 100 marks as part of his father's will, where he purchased the Mistley Fawn Hotel. Today there is still a Mistley Fawn Hotel, but unfortunately it's not the original building that Hopkins purchased. It was torn down much earlier, and a later version was built in the year 1735. Whilst here, he came across an alleged witchcraft trial that was being prosecuted at the behest of villagers by a man of the name of John Sterne. He actually appeared at the trial and listened to how Sterne presented his evidence, and obviously at that point decided to throw his lot in with Sterne to carry out their own investigations into witchcraft, because it was patently obvious that people were willing to pay for the death of other people. And before long, they had actually formed a company which involved 3 professional witch identifiers. These were women who knew the signs of a witch, and Sterne employed as a witch pricker. They were certainly psychopaths. They had no feelings or remorse for their victims, and they were handsomely rewarded, not only to dispose of alleged witches by identifying them, but also innocents that other people were prepared to pay good sums of cash for to be rid of them. In fact, by the end of his reign, he had accrued the princely sum of £1,000, which by modern standards would place him within a level close to being a millionaire. So it was certainly a very, very profitable exercise. Hopkins' reign of terror ended in England in 1647, when he died of natural causes. But earlier the same year, he had published a self-help guide into witchcraft entitled The Discovery of Witches. This publication was read by both Puritan and non-Puritan, and some copies found their way to New England, the scene of the infamous settler witch trials. There is no doubt that Hopkins' work inspired these settlers when witchcraft trials at that time had generally died down in England, but were to enjoy fresh victims in the new colonies. A year after Hopkins' death, Sterne, noticing the appeal of Hopkins' work, published his own guide entitled A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft, although there is no confirmation or even discovery that his work was used by the colonists. According to records, a figure of around 32 colonists were murdered on the accusation of witchcraft, and mostly by hanging. The causes generally, like England, circle round inexplicable outbreaks of disease or the unexpected loss of livestock or crops. Scientific knowledge of the causes of these disasters was in its infancy, and because no logical explanation could be sought, it had to be the work of a witch. Another explanation was the possibility of ergo poisoning in wheat, which drove people insane from the effects of it. But whatever the reason, many more victims were added to Hopkins' tally of victims through the publication of this book. It should be stressed that witchcraft was a belief held by all Protestants and Catholics, and the fact that here the Puritans were to be involved is no different to the bigotry of others not allied to their cause. Even in England today, there are still many period properties containing witch marks which were placed to prevent entry into a home by a witch. Here are some examples obtained from the fireplace of a home not far from the chapel itself, although no such marks have been found as yet within the chapel. Without a doubt, the 17th century was a footstep from the now fading Renaissance period towards a more secular and enlightened world that we live in today. The Renaissance period was the world of the medieval. In itself, it was a movement away from the harsh regimen of the earlier medieval, which internally had caused rifts and schisms within the Church of Rome. The Renaissance tended to look back at the perceived great periods of glory from ancient Rome and Greece, and it sought to replicate these periods in grandiose architecture and art. The dark side was simply its lack of scientific knowledge, which was embraced by the later age of reason. Sadly, it relied heavily on the quack science of alchemy rather than a reasoned approach based on observation and experimentation. And partly that was due to the restraints imposed by the Church itself, which perhaps rightly feared how true science and learning would weaken its own foundation built on fear and superstition. And of course there are many examples of this from the annals of history. As mankind better understood the world around him, many also questioned the efficacy of the Church and its relevance in a more enlightened society. In its infancy, many tried to weld science to religion to explain God's acts. Of course, they were clutching at straws, and an example of this thinking was that the universe was made of clockwork which was wound by God, and that the cycles of tides, seasons and weather was a direct result of that activity. So, although man had better understanding of nature, he knew little of its mechanics, which science was ready to share to a more enlightened and better educated world. And it was within the vacuum of these two periods that religion itself was changing, and the Protestant faith was born from that desire for change, and for a much better way to understand God. Unfortunately, many rulers preferred the established church, as it placed them over God in every aspect of people's lives. But change is organic, and as the Protestants grew and expanded, the Church of Rome grew weaker, as it rested itself on its past laurels. And like many kings and queens of Europe, they saw radical opinion and science as a threat. But ultimately, science won as people's lives went from poverty to comfort. I think in conclusion any viewer would look upon the Puritans as being straight-laced religious zealots, but nothing could be further from the truth. They envisioned a better world for all and believed that to grow closer to God they had to disavow many things they perceived as being corrosive to the society they wanted to create. They saw alcohol, sex outside of marriage, as being a corruptive influence on society. But they were also strong educators and laid the classroom foundations for education in America and even founded Harvard University. To their critics, they were killjoys who saw only bad in most people. Yet despite their social shortcomings, their legacies helped to shape not just the United Kingdom, but also the development of the USA too. And there can be few religious groups in the world that can claim these achievements. And so our story for today ends here. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed the amazing architecture inside this beautiful building and the history associated with it. And of course, until the next time, thank you.